This morning is from the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verses 22 to 30. At that time, the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." And Jesus answered, "I have told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name testify to me, but you do not believe because you do not belong to my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. What my Father has given me is greater than all else, and no one can snatch it out of the Father's hand. The Father and I are one."
I want to begin by thanking you for inviting me back. It's been a while since I've been with you, and since I last was with you, I have spent most of my time at North Liberty at the little congregation over there that caught me at a weak moment and convinced me to be their interim. And I have about a month left, I think 5 Sundays, so I guess I'm counting them. But I was free today, and so thank you for inviting me. Have you ever heard the dog owner's prayer? How many of you own a dog? Or have ever owned a dog? Or have ever liked a dog? Ever petted a dog? Okay? So if you've never heard the dog owner's prayer, this is especially for those who own dogs. We watched a movie last night about a dog named Patrick. It's just called Patrick. So if you've not seen that movie, I recommend it. We watched it with our granddaughter last night, and it was delightful. But here's the prayer. It goes like this. "Dear Lord, please make me into the person my dog thinks I am." You ever had your dog look at you and you think, "Oh, I'm not that good. You know, I don't really deserve all of that love. You know, I don't really enjoy following you around and picking up after you the way you think I do." Our dog was with us for, I think, 12, almost 13 years when we had to put her to sleep. Dogs tend to be overjoyed at the sight of their masters. When the master returns, the dog always has a very warm greeting for the master. Wags their tail usually, looks at you lovingly with their eyes, and you kind of look forward to that. And I have to admit, even though I grew tired of our dog's chores that were created for us, and I certainly didn't like what she did to our floor where she laid. We just spent a bunch of money, over $1,000, fixing the floor because of our dog. And so I did enjoy that, but I have to confess, for many weeks, actually, I missed that smile and that little wag of the tail when you'd walk in. And so those of you who own dogs know what I mean. Who wouldn't want to be that kind of person that everyone is so enthusiastic to greet that they just can't wait to see you? But what makes a dog act that way? What gives them such joy when seeing their human come through the door? What's going on in that little doggy brain that would cause them to act in such a way? How does a wise owner leverage so much loyalty into good and consistent canine behavior. To understand that, perhaps you need to know something about animal psychology. Those who know it best are people that we call whisperers. When we got our dog, frankly, it was after a lot of consideration. We had a weak moment where we agreed to keep a dog for a weekend. And after a weekend of taking care of someone's dog, who, by the way, it was a very well-behaved dog. And I said, if I could have a dog that was that well-behaved, I think I could own a dog. You know, because it was so well-behaved. It would sit when I told it to sit. I didn't even have to say anything. The owner told me how to use my hands. If you go like this, it'll sit. Try that. Oh, it's sit. Oh, that's pretty good. I thought, well, how could I resist owning a dog to just see if I could become its master? So I got a dog, and I went to Karen Wagley was her name, and she was I call her a dog whisperer. She really, every dog that walked into her little arena was just thrilled to see her. She was that kind of person. The dogs had an instant chemistry with her. And Karen Wagley taught me how to be a master of our dog. And many people don't. Many people, their dog is the master of them. You see them going down like this. Their dog has complete control over them. And I always feel sorry for those folks. I feel happy for the dog because the dog has got them licked. There is a dog whisperer who had a show on TV. I confess I don't know if he's still on TV, but Cesar Millan is a dog whisperer. And for many years anyway, he had a show on TV where he would help you turn your dog into a happy, obedient best friend. I watched this show with interest because oftentimes the dogs were terribly unruly and just oftentimes really kind of nasty dogs that you wouldn't want to have in your home or anywhere near you. But he would come in and he had an understanding of what it was that a dog wants and also what a dog needs. So the dog's going to be happy and healthy. He said that dogs need three things. They need exercise, they need discipline, and they need affection. What do they need? They need exercise, discipline, and affection. Gee, I need all of those things too. We all do. So we're not that much different from our dogs. He says it also has something to do with the master's demeanor. And that's something Karen taught us, that the dog will never let you be the master unless you are determined to be the master. And so that was one thing that we had to figure out right away. If I want to walk there, you cannot lie in my way, because I'm going to walk there, and if you're lying in my way, you're in my way, right? And if you're the master, you cannot let the dog be in your way, because you're the master. And you have to have the demeanor of a master if you want the dog to do what you want it to do. Your facial expressions say a lot. Even the way you tilt your head can say a lot to the dog. I learned that the weekend when we kept our neighbor's dog. Just by hand signals, if you go like this, the dog would come. If you go like this, the dog would sit up. There was all sorts of things that dog would do just by looking at you, keeping its eyes on you. Dogs are very observant. They understand that what a dog sees when he sees his human is key to training your dog. And if you want your dog to be a good dog, you have to understand that. If you get inside an animal's brain and help it to act in its own best interest, then you're definitely on your way to being a whisperer yourself. This was the basis of the article that Milan wrote in New Yorker magazine called What the Dog Saw. It was written by Malcolm Gladwell. If you want to look that article up, it's a good one. Today's gospel reading is not about dogs, and it's not about what the dog saw. It is instead about what the sheep saw. And we've, as Ron mentioned, we're talking a lot about sheep and shepherds this morning. Okay, you say dogs are one of the smartest domestic animals. What about sheep? You think sheep are very smart? What do you think? Can sheep be trained, you think? Can they be trained to do anything from, like, for instance, you can train a dog to help a disabled person. Could you do that with a sheep, you think? Dogs can sniff out bombs. Could a sheep do that? Dogs, like I say, they'll sit up, they'll shake your hands. Dogs will even herd sheep. I saw a dog in Minnesota one time just use its eyes, and it would go like this and the sheep would run. It never barked, it never bit them, it just looked at them. It was amazing. I say it's amazing because we used to chase sheep and they never went where we wanted them to go. They seemed like the dumbest animals on the farm. My dad raised cattle, and when I got to be a teenager and I didn't like to mow the lawn anymore, he bought sheep because somebody was going to have to eat the grass if I wasn't going to mow the lawn. And so he started with about a dozen, and I think he got up to about 80. And you get 80 sheep and try to get them to go where you want them to go, you better know what you're doing. And we didn't. And so what I learned about sheep is if the first one goes there, they'll all go there unless you stop them. And it's pretty hard to stop them once they get going. That's what I learned about sheep. They have a reputation of being intellectually challenged. That's the category that they tend to fit in, the dumb category. Preachers sometimes insist that Jesus chose sheep as a metaphor for his followers for that reason, that we're not too smart. Well, that's kind of insulting. Not really how you want to be thought of by your master. Not very smart. So, having said that, has anyone here ever raised sheep? Okay, couple. Okay, good. 3 people. Okay. I would say sheep have a reputation for being skittish, for sure. I've already kind of insinuated that from my experience of trying to herd sheep. I think my problem was that I was around cattle too much. You can't treat sheep the way you do cattle. If you put a stick here and a stick here and you walk out, you make yourself really big when you're herding cattle, and they will pay attention to you that way. And sheep, they don't pay any attention to that at all. Like I say, they're very skittish. Sheep are different in that they are a prey animal. In other words, other animals like to eat them. So instinctively, they're a little bit worried about their surroundings and anyone that comes towards them. They're concerned about their security. have this image of a flock of sheep that doesn't exactly call to mind a meeting of intellectuals. Many people believe that there are three levels of stupidity in the world: dumb, dumber, and sheep. So having said that, it suggests that I have a very low opinion of sheep. But that would be wrong. It may surprise you, but real shepherds who work with sheep every day, and I have to say, my dad got smarter the longer that he was, but I would never put him in the class of a real shepherd. He never called them names. He never spent enough time with them to really get to know them. He always told us which ones to watch out for, because they'll get you if you're not careful. I mean, they'll hit you from behind, and that doesn't feel good. But I have been around some real shepherds, and I really have learned from them. Real shepherds who walk with their sheep every day don't see it that way, that sheep are not stupid. In fact, probably smarter than cattle for sure. They would argue that sheep are really among the most intelligent of the animals that we might have on our farm. Just take, for example, the brain of a sheep. If you could take your brain and set it on a table, it's hard to do, but if you did, and if you would set the brain of a chimpanzee next to your brain, and then you set the brain of a sheep next to those other two brains, you would not be able to tell much difference between those brains. They look very much alike. Recent studies have shown that sheep have very good memories. Did you know that sheep are able to differentiate between pictures of human faces for up to 2 years from the time that they first learn to associate something with that picture? Now, mind you, they're not out there in the field doing algebra, but they're also not the most mindless critters on the farm. Good shepherds know that they have charges that are pretty smart, which is why good shepherds become whisperers themselves. They're just kind of like Milan with dogs, only with sheep. A good shepherd understands what the sheep see when they see the shepherd. There's a shepherd in Australia named John Powell who's a sheep whisperer. After several years of drought that reduced his flock and a snake killed his loyal sheepdog, John was faced with a dilemma: how to keep a herd of sheep in the most economical and simple way. So he restocked his farm with new lambs. He noticed that his daughter was feeding them willow leaves, which is apparently sort of like giving chocolate to a 10-year-old. John was always close by and noticed that as these lambs got older, they would start to follow him anywhere he went, especially if he would give them some of those willow leaves. And once these lambs became older sheep, they became the leaders of his flock. And as they would follow John around, pretty soon the whole flock would follow him around. It's called the herd instinct. The other sheep would go wherever he and the leaders went. Just by showing up and being recognized by the leaders of the flock, John was able to herd as many as 1,000 sheep that way. Now, I know that story has to be true because I saw it myself. My friend Jim, who's a very good sheep whisperer, has 1,000 sheep, and he'll go out and just walk among his sheep and he'll talk to them. He names them, he pets them, plays with them, and they just follow him right into the barnyard, right where he wants them to go. He doesn't have to have a dog. He doesn't have to take a stick. All he does is open the door, and they walk right in and follow him right in. And he shuts the gate, and it just looks real simple when he does it. So I know that this is possible. It's all about knowing the sheep. Now, from this perspective, it shouldn't surprise us then that in the scripture today, Jesus chooses the image of a shepherd, because a shepherd is a sheep whisperer who knows his sheep intimately. He's someone who is also known by the sheep. He wasn't the first to use the image. This image of a sheep and the shepherd appears elsewhere in the Bible. Leaders are often compared, for instance, to shepherds in the ancient world. Israel's history reveals that the whispering abilities of those shepherds made a difference. In Ezekiel, for instance, in chapter 34, the prophet Ezekiel compares bad shepherd kings of Israel, calling them greedy. They would feed themselves but not feed the sheep. How do you suppose the sheep like that? Not too good. He said that these bad shepherds will make the sheep lie down in dangerous places. God will seek the lost, he says, and bring back the strayed. That God will bind up the injured and help strengthen the weak. That's what the good sheep whisperer will do, he says. Now, these are some of the things that are key to keeping a good flock, to ensure that it's done well. God said that he would set up one shepherd over them, my servant David, who shall feed them and be their shepherd. Now, in the New Testament, of course, Jesus uses this image of the Good Shepherd, who's both the son of David and the Son of God. In our lesson today, Jesus picks up God's critique of Israel's bad shepherds. But this time, he kind of links that to the Pharisees, doesn't he? In this case, the Pharisees are the bad shepherds. And then he expresses this again. He says what the good shepherd does. He says the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep in verse 11. And then he says that includes his own life. I am the good shepherd, Jesus says, and the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Unlike strangers and hired hands who treat the sheep like mindless critters, exploiting them or running away when things get tough, the good shepherd is intimately and almost symbiotically connected with his flock. It's no coincidence that Jesus once again brings up his sheep whisperer credentials during the festival of the dedication. This festival we now call Hanukkah. It celebrated the victory of the Maccabees over the foreign Gentile invaders during the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Maccabees gave their lives in defense of the nation. They were fiercely devoted to God, and they were fiercely devoted to protecting the temple. They did everything that was in their power in order to preserve the temple for the people. Now Jesus is about to do the same thing. But he does it on an even greater scale than they did. Because the flock for Jesus grew quite a bit, because now it's not just the Israelites, but also the Gentiles that are going to be included in the flock. The Jews, meaning the Jewish leaders, wanted Jesus to declare that he was the Messiah. But Jesus declares that he was already done this by revealing that he's the shepherd, that God had promised this through Ezekiel. As if that weren't enough, Jesus' works should be testimony enough. The reason the Jewish leaders didn't see it that way was because they didn't belong to Jesus' flock. They didn't recognize his voice. They didn't recognize his manner or the tilt of his head. They didn't care for his leadership. What did these sheep see instead? They saw a rabbi, someone who was a rabble-rouser, someone who was a malcontent, someone who was threatening their position of power. They saw someone who was draining the loyalty of the people. Instead of being loyal to them, now they're starting to follow this guy Jesus. They saw someone who was taking pot shots at them, pointing out their self-righteousness and their hypocrisy. Not something that really makes you like a guy too much, I guess. In this sense, the sheep saw accurately. By interpreting what these so-called sheep saw accurately, Jesus reveals to them to be not sheep at all. Instead, these leaders, these Pharisees, were what Jesus describes as sheep in wolves' clothing. Pardon me, wolves in sheep's clothing, the other way around. These leaders who should have been the elders of the people, who should have been caring for the flock, instead were failing to do what they were called to do, and Jesus compares them to the bad shepherds that we read about in Ezekiel. My sheep hear my voice, Jesus says in verse 27. I know them and they follow me. They follow him because they know they'll receive the three things that sheep need. They're going to be well fed, they're going to be safe, and they're not going to be stressed out. Because why? They have someone looking out for them. And they know that that someone will help take care of them. Jesus sums all this up in one sentence in verse 28. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. It's an abundant life that's made possible because the Good Shepherd puts the sheep ahead of himself. Last week, I referred to an English shepherd by the name of James Rebanks. In his book about shepherding in the hills of England, he talks about different rules for shepherding. His first rule of shepherding is that it's not about you. It's about the sheep and about the land. He demonstrates this like no other in referring to Jesus. When the sheep see Jesus, they see a shepherd who has their best interest at heart. And they know it because he's willing to die for them. No one will snatch them out of my hand, says Jesus in verse 28. He does this because he is God's promised good shepherd. In fact, he is, in fact, God in person. In verses 29 and 30, it says, what my Father has given me is greater than all else, and no one can snatch it out of my Father's hands. The Father and I are one. We who are part of Jesus' flock have heard the voice of Jesus whispering to us. But like Jesus, we also have a shepherding task. We sheep are also under shepherds who care for and tend the sheep that God has given to us. Today being Mother's Day, we think of often the role of a mother as much like that of a shepherd caring for her sheep. A mother cares for her children. But each of us in that sense have a flock of our own, whether it's our children or our family, or whether it's the people that we work with. Whoever God has placed in our sphere of influence, we have some responsibility to shepherd those that God has given to us in our environment, to ensure that those people are well fed spiritually and physically, to help create an environment where peace can be valued by the people who live there around us and live with us. When we do that well, others will want to follow us where we lead. If we do it poorly, of course, we wouldn't expect them to follow us, would we? So that leads us to a little different prayer. The sort of prayer I was thinking of, maybe a prayer for a pastor might be a prayer like this: Lord, help me to be the pastor my congregation thinks I am. That's what Rosanna might pray, that she would be the pastor you think she is. And then also another prayer, a third prayer, a prayer for a congregation might be: Lord, help me to be the kind of sheep that leads others to the shepherd. In other words, are you the kind of sheep that bring people to your pastor and help your pastor to be a pastor to them? And also, are you the kind of sheep that lead people to Jesus so that they want to see who you follow? I told you about my friend who's a sheep whisperer. He has hundreds of sheep, and when he walks out among them, I asked him once, Jim, how do you get them to follow you like that? He said, I always spend enough time with them to make sure they're looking at me. So friends, are you spending enough time looking at Jesus? How can you be the kind of sheep that will lead others to the shepherd if your eyes are not on Jesus? Are we looking at Jesus? I pray we are.